we are live. There's so many different toggles to press right now.
Okay.
So, hello everybody, and welcome to this version of the Seattle Use Our Meetup virtual on YouTube Live. So, we're incredibly happy and excited to be here, and we have two wonderful guests above me right here. We have Jacqueline Nullis and Emily Robinson. So, I guess I won't take too much more time because I got us to start late, so I'll give the floor to y'all.
All right. Hey, everyone. It's always hard when you have two people. But yeah, I'm guessing since you're all here, you probably know this, but Jacqueline and I wrote a book called Build a Career in Data Science, which we'll be talking about today. So here's the book. So we're going to spend the first half or so reading and discussing some excerpts, and then we're very excited to take your questions. And they can be related to the topics we talked about, but this is a 16-chapter book, and we're only going to read three excerpts from 3 chapters. So it's totally fine if you have questions that is like unrelated to what we directly talked about. I will say, though, our book is kind of all about the career side, the so-called like soft skills of data science. So if you're like, what deep learning library, should I learn next? Like, you could ask that, but I would say in terms of like the things that we've really thought deeply around about this book are things like finding a job, building a portfolio, negotiating, and the excerpts that we'll read. So just wanted to, if you want to ask a super technical question to quiz us, well, don't do it to quiz us, but
you sound like traumatized. Did something happen one time?
No, nothing happened. It's just funny sometimes because I don't know. There were sometimes when the questions were like totally out of left field, and I was like, I happen to like be able to answer that, but I don't know how you thought of this during this talk.
And I will mention before we start, and probably again at the end, but before we start, if you haven't read the book, this should still be useful. This should still be fun, informative, whatever. You can buy the book at bestbook.cool and use the code BUILDBOOK40%, makes it 40% cheaper. We also, Emily and I have started doing a podcast about the book. We do a episode, or each episode is about a chapter. That's like we're 11 episodes in or so. It's a lot of fun. You can go to podcast.bestbook.cool to get that. You don't have to do either. We would love it if you did both, but don't feel any pressure during this hour about that.
Yes, and bestbook.cool is the short link Jacqueline came up with. Mine is datascicareer.com. They both lead to the same place, but I think it gives you a little insight into our personalities. Right. But yeah, with that, should we get started?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Next served. All right. So I am going to read from the chapter on working with stakeholders. So this is a big part pretty much of any data scientist job. So your stakeholder could be an engineering team you're working with. It could be a product manager. You can even think of your manager as a stakeholder. It could be the CEO, and so on and so forth. So learning how to work with them well is a really key part that I think is often not discussed in schools, and you're sort of thrown into it maybe a little bit when you start working. So I wanted to read from this part in that chapter is about understanding stakeholder goals. So everyone has goals when working a job, objectives they want to achieve when they go to work every day. These goals are determined both by the job the person has and their personal traits such as ambition and a desire for a career-life balance. A lead engineer, for example, may focus on getting their current project complete so they can get a promotion. Or a senior executive may know that they are going to leave the company soon and want to avoid rocking the boat before then. These goals shape what people do at work and how they respond to other people's actions. A project that takes longer than expected could be terrible for the promotion-oriented engineer, but great for the executive who doesn't want to do anything. When you're working with stakeholders as a data scientist, it's critical that you understand their goals. Exactly the same analysis could be received well or poorly, depending on the stakeholder's perspective. Consider an analysis of the performance of a certain product being sold on the company website. Suppose that a stakeholder is the person who manages that product, and your analysis found that the product was not selling well in South America. If the stakeholder had the goal of making the product seem to be amazing to the company because it was their idea, the analysis could be received very poorly because it shines a light on the problem. On the other hand, if the stakeholder had the goal of keeping an entire portfolio of products performing well, knowing which one may need to be cut is very helpful. And then we talk a little bit about how to try to understand their goals and motivations by things like asking them directly, asking them right out what's important to them. Asking around, seeing whether your coworkers have worked with the stakeholder before, and then inferring the stakeholder's motivation from their actions. So Jacqueline, I want to open that up to you. Because I think sometimes people can overly simplify it. They're like, okay, if you're, and there's broad rule, like, okay, maybe you're communicating with an engineer, you might do more technical stuff, or a CEO, like a high level summary. But what I like about this is it could be the same kind of, the person's same type of role, maybe even a similar background, but depending on, the specifics of what kind of work they're doing in the company, like we said, if they're responsible for, if they promoted that product versus if they're looking at the whole line, this could be received very differently. So what's been your experience?
Yeah, so it's like, it is really helpful to try and figure out what people's goals are. And their goals, it's kind of like a combination of like both goals and also like risk aversion, which is to say that they're like, you work with some people, they're like, I want this product to succeed. And you're like, okay, but we're gonna have to take some risky bets for that product to work. And they're like, awesome, cool. And then there are other people, they're like, I want this product to succeed. You have to do this one lightly risky thing. We aren't exactly sure if it'll work or not. They're like, oh, I would never do that. And like, they both claim to have the same goal of wanting the product to succeed, but like some people are, and I'm sure if you asked either directly, they both be like, I would do whatever it takes. But in practice, they don't, because some people, like even if the goals are the same, sometimes the risk aversion levels are different. And so that's why it's like, I think it's true. You may know off the bat, like, oh, they're the product manager, blah, blah, blah. Of course their goal is to do blah, blah, blah. But like, is that their goal? Or is their goal to kind of keep their head as low as they can until they get the promotion to not have to worry about this anymore, right? Like and like that stuff, you're not going to get it by asking sometimes with some of these people, but like that stuff, you kind of got to like logic out a little bit, or like, well, look at what they did for the last 10 decisions. Like, wow, every time we tried to propose something lightly risky, they shot it down. Or likewise, oh, they would take whatever bet we put in front of them. Like, I think that kind of analysis is helpful. And I don't think junior data science, like it's hard to get out of like an undergrad degree in data science to be like, oh, what I'm ready for is like analyzing business decisions. But I do think that stuff really is helpful.
Yeah, and I think this is something, so we actually read this excerpt in sent just this chapter to a data science undergraduate class, and it was pretty well received because of exactly this. It's not typically taught. And so people are left wondering like, okay, but how do I learn this? Like, there's no like class, there's not even like a Coursera course or whatever, right? You're out of school that is like, learn how to, or maybe there is, who knows? I don't think there is, how to communicate effectively with stakeholders as a data scientist. So I think for me, something that was helpful is practicing when I didn't do this intentionally, but as like an undergraduate, doing some extracurricular stuff in student government, because you get some of that experience, right? Like you're trying to work together as a team to accomplish something. So in that case, it wasn't just working with other students, it was working with, I was at Rice University. They have, the dorms are kind of these houses that each have magisters, so faculty members who kind of oversee things. And so if we wanted to advocate something, like those faculty members were some of the stakeholders, or let's say we wanted to join together and change some dining stuff, right? Like the dining, head of dining was a stakeholder. I had a meeting with him once. And so just, I think just getting this practice, and if you didn't get this kind of before, obviously like practice at work as well. And, what's been helpful for me is really explicitly asking for feedback, because I remember there's been times, I'm not necessarily on data science stuff, but like for other kind of corporate stuff, wanting to like sort of influence without authority, and I was feeling really stymied. I'm like, why aren't other people getting like why this problem is important? And I remember talking to another data scientist about that. It was really illuminating because he shared some stuff. It's like, oh, well, this person, was just promoted to a manager. So like, they probably want to like be doing X, Y, Z, or like this person, this happened 3 years ago. And here are the concerns I heard around like why, they're cautious about doing that. So yeah, I think just getting practice and not worrying about being perfect, and kind of being willing to learn, and recognizing that, for example, if we take more of a micro thing, like making a data visualization. So I think sometimes it's like, oh, you want, tons of grid lines in a data visualization, like that clutters it, it's bad. But if you're using that visualization and the people you're presenting it to, say it's like a line graph, will want to like directly look at certain points and like, okay, exactly at this point on this day, what was the number? Having that, grid line is very helpful because they can like read that off directly. Oh, it was 44%.
So I want to take this in a twist direction you weren't expecting, because I didn't know you were going to talk about this. So you just fell into a trap, which is we'll run with it. A few days ago, I saw this Twitter thread that like super resonated with me. And it was like, there were a lot of people chiming in, but Margot Rogers and Erica Joy in particular, they were discussing this very thing of like, well, how do you find someone's goals? How do you bring something up? It is a super rich white people culture thing of like in rich white people culture, you can't just directly say stuff sometimes. You can't just have a conflict. And a lot of corporate America is learning when you can and can't bring stuff up. And this thread resonated with me because like I've been burned by this where it's like, I will very directly say, hey, what we're doing now isn't working. Here's the things we need to change for it to work. And like dropping that in front of people, they're like, whoa, you can't just say that like in front of others, like that, the shame. And like, kind of you have to like practice, like learning this stuff is learning when is it okay to bring stuff up, when is it not, who are the people that if you bring them a curveball, like, hey, or, something that kind of hurts to talk about a little bit, like this product isn't working, who is the people who'd be receptive to that even though it hurts, and who are the people who would not hear it because they're too busy being hurt. And like, it's weirdly racist that this stuff exists. It's definitely true. And like, yeah, I don't know. I had a rich white upbringing, and like, so I feel like I'm better suited for it for many, and I struggle with it. So like, I don't know. If you're finding yourself not good at it, it could very much be unrelated to your how much you're trying on it, and just like how many years of practice you have talking to white people in a way that doesn't hurt their feelings.
Yeah, I would also say that there can also, I think, be like an element of sexism too. Like, so it's often talking about how women like have to like soften their tone or use lots of exclamation points or like, oh, I just wanted to follow up and like check in on this because, and that's not just, something that was developed in a vacuum. It's because if, something's for women, if they are more straightforward, then they can get negatively dinged for that. Like, oh, you're being same with Black people as well. Like, oh, you're being aggressive, you can't just do that. So yeah, I feel like that's a bit of I think it's good to bring up because I was actually thinking the other day too of like influencing without authority and how, right. So this is the idea of, okay, how can you make change when you can't just like make it happen, right? You can't just like declare it to be true, right? Like let's say you're not the hiring manager, you can't just decide who to hire. And I think there's skills around that you could learn, but then I also realized like, oh my God, when I was thinking back to a time when I was like, when there is someone at the top who has that same vision of you, it goes so much easier, right? It's like magic. It's just like a light switch. As soon as they say that, everyone's like, oh yeah. And you're like, wait, and there might've been no way that like, even if you were the best at influencing without authority, sometimes it just would never be as effective as someone who has that authority, both because, they're like have the kind of direct power, but also because they have that authority, people are also more willing to like believe them right away. When they say something is important or it should be this way, they're like, oh my God, well, they're like, the top of the hierarchy, they must be super smart. Like they have tons of experience. If they're saying that, that must be true.
Yeah. So to bring it all together, dealing with stakeholders is important. The stuff is very important and useful for data scientists, but also it is not something you can always just do. Sometimes it's the circumstance, your gender or race, whatever has influences on it. And also some people are just have years of practice with this because their upbringings, whatever, made them very well suited for corporate America. And that's just the biz.
And sometimes you need to escalate to your manager if like you're just like if the stakeholder is just refusing to hear something where you're like, I don't think we should launch this experiment, and they're like, no, it's my problem. You just gotta like put it up the chain.
Yes, I like the thumbs up coming out. Yeah, it's true. Okay, let me do. How about I do the second one?
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, this is funny. I like this because it's the first time we've done a bunch of these book readings. This is the first time we're trying to do more like senior level reading parts of it, as opposed to like the how do you become a data science. Just in the first place part. So my reading is going to be from the second to last chapter about what do you do after you become a senior data scientist? What's next? And in this chapter, we really
lay out the last chapter.
I thought quitting. Oh, you're right. It is the last chapter. Okay. Well, anyway, yeah, people would have figured that out when they bought the book at bestbook.cool. No, just kidding. Anyway, so this last chapter, what do you do next after senior? And we basically lay out three possible scenarios, although there are many. One, you could become a manager. Two, you become a principal data scientist. Three, hey, go into independent consulting or something. So I want to talk a little bit about a principal data scientist. I recently was a principal data scientist, although now I'm no longer. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about principal data scientists. So a principal data scientist is a job. It's a job that involves multiple responsibilities. So one, you influence the data science strategy. So a principal data science scientist has to lay down the plan for tackling data science problems. Hey, is modeling payment fraud even feasible? Should a neural network be used here or not? So the manager is responsible for like, what are the ideas we're trying to solve? What's the plan? But like the principal's on the hook for like, how would this work? Or like, is this even technically possible? a principal has to mentor junior data scientists. So a principal is a data scientist with a lot of experience. So it's their job to share their knowledge with the more junior employees, because it's important for the whole team to go well. And like having the principal just do the work for themselves is not as useful as having a team of people who are all constantly growing and getting more skills. So like it is the principal's job to keep everyone growing, not just them. And then actually solving the difficult problems. So when someone on the team, junior data scientist says, hey, this data is missing these core values. How are we going to use it then? It's oftentimes the principal data scientist who has to sit there and think of like, okay, what is the real tactical plan to dealing with this problem? So compared to a manager, a principal data scientist is still doing, you're doing data science work. So it's a great role for people who love data science. But because of how critical a principal data scientist can be, you need to have someone who has maturity, responsibility, and a lot of experience, because like a lot is resting on them. And although it's related to data science like work, it's rare that you're actually doing individual contributor work. So like you're not going to make a single analysis generally or create a single machine learning model. It's really your job to like help everyone do those sorts of things rather than doing that yourself. So I thought I would talk about that a little bit, because like I recently was one, so it's kind of fun to talk about that. But like, I think there's this really common situation where like just people are senior data scientists. They're like, I enjoy being a senior data scientist. I don't want to be a manager. What do I do next? And I think you could stay a senior data scientist forever. That's a very reasonable job. But I think there are some people who I've worked with who are senior data scientists, and they kind of have this thing where like they're doing their senior data sciencey thing, and they're like, they notice the person next to them doing something, and they're like, they're using this kind of model, but they really should be doing that. Or like, the roadmap has us to work on the making fraud model, but like that will never work. And I know for these reasons. And if you have this, like, if you're a senior data scientist and you have this thing inside you where you are noticing improvements that could be made all around you, and you kind of wish you could just start like, let me just help you out there, and let me help you out there. Like that is like the spark that gets you to be a principal data scientist. I think it's a really cool job. I like it. It's kind of doubling down on a data science bet. Like if you like being a senior data scientist, if the things you like about that job, you would got to do twice as much of. So if you got to do like, hey, even bigger decisions about what models we should use and how do we handle these parameters, it's great. But you're also doubling down on the hard parts, right? Like you have to have more of those conversations that you talked about in yours with stakeholders, where like you have to be convincing people, hey, we can't ever we can't do a payment fraud model. It will never work. You have to have more of those conversations. So you're really kind of like doubling down on both sides, which I don't know, if you're a person like me who like likes intense jobs where you get to like do big stuff, like that's great. But if you want a person, you're like, I just want a 40-hour-a-week job. I don't want to have that stress of all the different parts of the team on me. Maybe not the job for you.
Yeah, I think it's also stressful because like, it's basically the buck stops here role, right? Like when it's like, whether that's a very technical problem, like how the heck are we going to model this? Like nothing's working, right? You may have to dive into like the technical part and like, or someone's like, this code isn't working and you have to figure out that. So it's both on the technical side, but also from that stakeholder side too, right? It's like, this team is being like really intractable, or like, I have no idea how to like help them. That becomes your role. And most teams, like it's pretty rare to have, if you think of it in terms of like, okay, junior, sort of mid-level, senior, and principal. Principal is the rarest one, right? There might be one principal for every like 10 data scientists, maybe even more. So you're usually not, it's not like you're in a team where it's like, okay, but I'll go ask like 4 other principal people, right? Like you may be the only principal at a company or one of 2. And that second person, if it's a technical problem, they might be an expert in like a totally different technical area. So I think I like that you said you can stay as a senior data scientist, and that's fine, because I think that's true. I think you shouldn't approach it as like, a principal is just a senior, but like better or faster. Like it does also have some like different parts to the role. Like you said, you're no longer doing sort of more like, you are often the person who has to deal with the really hard problems. You no longer get things that much where you're like, yep, this is in my wheelhouse. This is pretty standard. I can just kind of chug along.
Yeah, and I think to your point about the buck stopping here, you could be like, we should totally make an anomaly detection model. That'll really help out here. You can make your team spend 6 months on that. Or you can, cause your team to spend 6 months on it, have it not work out. And that's kind of your responsibility to like that guilt. And whether, like maybe it's worth the try. But if you're not a person if you're a person who, hey, I just wasted 6 months of a team's time, and it's hard for you to emotionally handle that, then like the principal is not an easy job, because there's a lot of times where you like, yes, the buck stops with you. So you got to really it's not even, I don't know if it's confidence, it's like ability to like shrug off guilt as like, I just did the best I can.
And to deal with uncertainty, right? And to deal with like, sometimes I may not know this, like with the sort of more messy things, like to be okay that I'm not 100% certain this is the right way, but I gotta like decide and commit and put resources. Yeah, and like you said, not feel like racked with guilt or self-doubt if things don't work out, because you will have times that fail. I do want to plug, I was lucky enough to get to read a really great book early called Staff Engineer by Will Larson. That's coming out, just at the end of the month, which is, as you might guess from the title, right? It's like more oriented to engineers, but given data science is a newer field, it also is somewhat modeled after engineering. Sometimes it's like actually in an engineering organization. I think it's really helpful. So like for me, one thing that was insightful there is, we're sort of describing like, he talks about 4 archetypes of staff engineers that he found by like interviewing a bunch of different companies. And the most common one is what we've been talking about, kind of this tech lead role for a team. But at least on the engineering side, he also sees people like a solver who, like, in this case, you are for Stripe or whatever, you are the API expert. Like, you actually are not really so much like leading a team. Like, you have one very specific, super thorny problem, and you will dive very deep into that. Or they also talked about the architect. So like you kind of think about, let's say, for example, the front end of the website, which could be like 7 engineering teams. And again, this is all like engineers, but I at least found it helpful because it also talked about like, how do you get that role, which I think we haven't really talked through, because unlike, I would say most of the time, if you're doing like pretty well at your role, like you usually every few years, right, you'll probably like keep kind of going up like to you at senior, but senior at some places is like a terminal level, right? And it does take a lot more to get promoted to principal. And so if that's what you want, I think there's a lot of things to learn about that, like finding, for example, the right type of projects to work on that can show that you have these skills. Or you need a lot of support from your manager and even your director. Again, this depends on the company, but like for staff engineering roles, a lot of company, you have to put together like a whole packet and like go into a room and debate. And again, because you can't have like as many staff engineers as senior engineers, not everyone is going to get promoted who wants it, right? Even maybe not half of the people.
Yeah, so I've mostly worked at, I guess, I've worked at a lot of smaller companies, and the people I've seen who become these principals, it's usually not like, and then the committee decides, it's usually they kind of get battlefield promoted to it. Like, you start naturally doing, because like someone on the team has to do the architecture, and you're the one who notices, hey, we don't have an architecture, this is bad, I'll just do it. And you do that enough times, and eventually you kind of fall into it. But that it's yes, I agree with you. There are not that many of these positions available, things like that. So it's not an easy. It's not like junior to senior where it's like, wait a few years and you will become it.
Yeah. But yeah, so anything else you want to talk about for that section?
No, let's do the last one.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to pull this up. So this is from chapter 14. I know which chapter is which, just saying. I'm totally kidding. Okay, so chapter 15 is about joining the data science community. So we talk about ways to, build your network and also give back by doing public work. So I'm going to, we talk about 4 things you could do to do that. One is continuing to build your portfolio. The second is attending conferences. Third is giving talks. And then 4th is contributing to open source. So I'm going to read from the giving talks section. Giving talks can offer you a lot of opportunities for growth and also give you leverage to go to more talks and conferences. One fight that you may have is to get enough time to go to conferences to improve your skills and network, but giving talks is a great way to represent your company, in addition to the monetary benefits of talking, which make it less burdensome to your employer. Although it may seem that you need to be an industry expert, a spectacular orator, or a social butterfly to give a talk, that's not the case. Giving talks is actually a great strategy for an introvert. After your talk, people will come up to you to pay compliments, ask follow-up questions, or just introduce themselves. Having your talk be a conversation topic is an enhanced version of the general advantage of talking about the topic of the conference when you're trying to meet people. And so, here we go. This section could be a whole book in and of itself, but we want to emphasize that the bar for giving a good talk might be lower than you may think. You're not giving a TED Talk here or keynoting a huge conference. Those folks have tons of experience and have likely hired speaking coaches. And we believe that if you want to give a good talk, you should focus on 2 things: entertaining people and motivating them. if people aren't interested when you're speaking, it'll be very hard to teach them anything. Additionally, people can get a limited number of takeaways from a 20, 30, or even 60-minute talk. But if you can fan the desire to learn more and equip the audience with the tools to get started, you'll have delivered a lot of value. So I wanted to read that section because Jacqueline and I have both given a fair amount of talks, including obviously the one we're doing right now.
How meta, yeah.
Yeah, right? And it's actually how we met. So we were both speakers at Day to Day Texas, a conference in Austin. And that is, so we saw each other's talks. We went up to each other afterward. That was the first time we met. And then Jacqueline emailed me a couple months later and was kind of like, hey, like Mandy reached out to me. Would you be interested in writing a book? So like that was an amazing opportunity that, was unlocked because we both sort of put ourselves out there and, gave a talk and wanted to share knowledge with the community.
Yeah. And like, I know sometimes like for me, like I remember it was like a year I saw a talk by Dr. Catherine Nelson at, I think, Women in Data Science Seattle, or Puget Sound, like 2 years ago. And then like a year later, I was dealing with some problem. I'm like, that's just like her talk. And like, I then contacted her. So it's like the payoff for you giving a talk can be long after the talk. You never know. Like people often remember this stuff, even if all they remember is, hey, this person thought about that concept, that can go a long way. That said, Emily, I'm legitimately curious. How do you think this is still, or how much do you think this is still relevant in quarantine? Hopefully, which won't last too much longer. But like, how relevant do you think this is?
Yeah, I think it's definitely still somewhat relevant. And one advantage of doing virtual talks is that it's much more easier to have them recorded, and having them recorded is a big benefit because, so for me, the first talk I gave was in person, but it was also recorded. And then I was reached out to by West Point because they saw the recording. They wanted me to come speak. When I applied to speak at our studio conference, they asked for, if you had a recording of a talk you've given, so they could get an idea. And so I was able to submit that. So I do think that's one advantage with these virtual talks is if you're getting started, being able to have it recorded. If you want, I don't do this much. It could also be a good way to like watch yourself and be like, oh, I realize that I'm doing this, or I gesture with my hands too much. I don't use it for that, but it's kind of a nice thing of, oh, now it is like a little bit of a part of your portfolio, right? More than if it wasn't recorded, because you can link it to your website, you could send it to people. That being said, I do think the networking part is a bit diminished. There's still some, like I know someone who gave a talk for the first time at boot camp, and like a couple people reached out afterwards. And, these are people in the boot camp. They're probably not now in the position, like, I don't know if she was looking for a job at some point, but a few years down the line, build your network for the long term. But that being said, like, I think more that's diminished is the value actually as an audience member. Because you can't, communicate with other audience members. I think being the speaker actually, compared to just attending a virtual meetup, you're much more likely to get people reaching out to you, to get people, right, who know you and like talk to you. So I think it's a bit diminished, but I think it can still very much be worth it. And also a big advantage if you live somewhere in like a small town where there aren't any meetups, you can now go speak at, you can speak at a meetup, whereas before they would have been like, no, we only have in-person speakers.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you still get the benefits of speaking. And yeah, I think there are lots of places that are like lightning talks, look for like calls for first time speakers. Like there's lots of people trying to make it accessible. But yeah, being an audience member, you don't get that, oh, let's 20 minutes before the conference or talk, whatever, let's all just sit around and drink coffee and meet people, which is upsetting.
Yeah, and we give a lot of like tips in the book. I also have a blog post on hookedondata.org about giving your first talk, but I probably wanted to read that excerpt because I think, it kind of talks about this barrier people can have. It'd be like, oh, I need to be an expert to give this talk, or I need to be like a great public speaker, or I need to be super extroverted. And I really think all of that is not true. So one, as someone who's learned something more recently, you're often in a better position to give kind of an introductory level talk. And for me, my first talk was A/B testing in the wild. It was 8 months into working at Etsy. I had a background in kind of academic experimentation, went to Etsy, millions of visitors right each day. And I'm like, oh, the problems here we're dealing with are like totally different from when I run my like lab experiment. And not just, some of them are technical problems, but some of them are stakeholder problems. So, I think, yeah, my talk wasn't like, here is the newest, coolest, most advanced technique for A/B testing, but that's not also what most people need. Like most people there were curious of like, hey, how how does A/B testing work as a company? I really have very little familiarity with that.
So I agree with what you just said, and I will also say, when I'm in these occasions where I actually do have to submit like a topic to a conference, and I'm like, I've never talked about this thing before, things like that. I still get that nervousness of like, oh my god, am I an expert? Are people going to call me out as a fraud? Like that never. I think provided you are entering a new field, that never goes away. So if you are feeling that, I agree with Emily. It is not. It is. I guess it is a valid feeling to have. It probably does not align with reality.
Yeah, and. Yeah, I think that's why I just want to encourage. For me, like I said, getting to meet Jacqueline, I've also gotten to two, so one conference in Europe, one meetup in Europe, and so advantage of conferences. Most tech conferences won't pay you to speak, but many of them will cover your travel and like accommodations. So like that was really cool because I probably otherwise couldn't have gone to these conferences. But I got to do that. I got to meet some great people. I spent a few extra days like in Europe. And so that was just really awesome and not something I would have expected necessarily would happen when I first started speaking.
Yeah. I don't think I've hit that yet. I've never had a full, no, I've maybe once had a full trip to pay for once out of in like 3 years or whatever. So maybe I hit it once, but like, yeah, you got to work to that one a little. Don't be surprised if you're not instantly getting like, $2,000,
Sure.
Honorariums or whatever from your talk.
Sure. Oh yeah. I mean, that's different.
Someday.
But at the very least, you should get a free ticket. I think that's kind of BS if you don't get a free ticket. And that can be like $700, right? And so that's like a nice thing. Even if your company is paying for stuff, if your company wouldn't have, right, like if the total cost of the conference with like travel, accommodations, and the ticket would be more than they pay, but you take off that ticket and they can afford it, like that's awesome.
Yeah, and like I don't know. It really depends on the conference for me. Some conferences, it's like our studio comp. It's like I would pay out of pocket because it's like a vacation to see all my friends. So cool. So I don't know. Yes. It's like I would not pay for lots of conferences out of pocket, things like that. But like it's pretty. Depending on the conference, it can be pretty fun. So
yeah, I love ours. I'm with you. Our studio conference last year was so much fun. We had a pajama party that we shared on Twitter, watching the finale of The Good Place. Yes.
Anyway,
shall we take questions?
Yeah, does that
for sure. Yeah, let's do that. Sorry, I set it up so that whoever was the main speaker was the main screen. So I'll switch back to the grid mode now. I don't think y'all saw that. But yeah, I also want to put a plug in for that last piece. If you want to give a talk at the Seattle UseR Meetup group, definitely email me, lshughes@live.com. Always looking for content to be sharing out to folks. And given right now that we're virtual, there are no physical distance issues. If you are further down in Tacoma or even further than that, just shoot me an email and we can set up a virtual meet like this. And it's a lot of fun to then practice your speaking skills. It's definitely more unique now because you're talking at a screen, not standing in front of as many people. So for me, at least, it's a lot easier to get more comfortable quickly with that. And then we do have 2 questions right now. So one's from Danny around the principal engineer or principal data scientist. Do you have any tips for shrugging off the guilt for when things don't work out that you believed would before?
We have a whole chapter.
We do have a whole chapter on this book, and I have a talk about this very thing. So for me, this is one of the biggest things I struggled with as a junior data scientist, especially, but even still, is like I'd be like, hey, let's build an anomaly. I remember my first job. I'm like, hey, let's build an anomaly model. It'll blah blah blah, and then like we spent 6 months on it, and it didn't work. And I'm like, and I remember thinking, if I was a better data scientist, maybe this would have worked. But like, that's not true. It's like the data isn't good enough, or there's just not enough noise, and there's too much noise in the data, and like there's so many things that it's very rarely the thing that makes or breaks it is how good your skills are as a data scientist. And like I totally make up the statistic, but for me, like 75% of projects I've started did not work out for whatever reason, and it could be the model, the data, the blah blah blah. Like there's like the stakeholders didn't like it in the end. Like there's so many things that doesn't work out. So the thing that helped me the most is one, realizing though, like the whole point of data science is you are trying to figure out if things will work or not to say in advance this is going to work, and thus when it does not work you feel bad. It's like, no, at the beginning you're like, hey, I think an anomaly detection model might work, let's try it out, and then it turns out no, it didn't work, and it's like, great, you learned something, the company learned something, blah blah blah. And I think it's just getting into that mindset of like, you are doing exploration and research, not making promises. Like, it's not software development where you say, I'm going to make a website and you make it. It's like, no, we're going to hope to try. And like, it's kind of the company's responsibility to structure themselves so that if you start working on something and it doesn't work, your company is ready to pivot, right? If the company is like, I'm a principal data scientist, tell me what we should work on, and we're gonna spend 6 months on it, and it better work because we've already sold it to our customers. That's a struggle. Like you don't. That's not your fault. That's the environment's fault. So I guess to summarize it, it's like, this is a very common thing in data science. It's not you. It's not just you, and you're not the only variable here. Rarely you're the variable that makes or breaks it. And the best thing you can do is just get into a mindset of experimentation, trying stuff, switching quickly, and not getting locked into massive projects.
Yeah, I think all of that. I also want to add, because this is something I want to get better at, but is, there's a reason that the principal role, right, is like kind of hard to get. You need years of experience. Is kind of the idea is you've had practice, right? You've taken risks before, you've had failures like on a smaller scale, and that helps like kind of build up your tolerance. You help learn to deal with this, before it's like a project that is more like critical to the company, right? And you're like, oh, this is like a 6-month thing versus like, oh, it's a 2-week thing. I think it's both. Obviously you learn while doing that, but what you also learn is kind of like regulating emotions, like normalizing it and so forth. And the last thing I'll add is, at least I found it really helpful to have peers. So like be part of the community. So one, you can do this from something like Jacqueline gave a great talk about data science failures, right? You can go and, watch that and you can like learn from one data scientist's experience. But I know, for example, I hear for managers, a lot of time, for first-time managers, having that peer group is so important. Like having someone you could talk to that's like, oh, I have to fire someone and I'm really I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to handle it. And like talking to someone who's kind of been there and done that can just be extremely helpful, because it helps you. Obviously you get maybe some advice from them, but it also just helps you normalize that and be like, okay, like, Jacqueline, as you've always been saying, right? It's not just, oh, if I was a better data scientist, this wouldn't happen, right? If you hear this from someone that you do really admire, you're like, oh my God, you have the same thing too, or like you made this mistake. Like that can, I think, really, really help you put your experience into context.
Yeah, and actually, sorry, I have a tangential point that you just made me remember, which is if you're a manager, so I've been a manager, director, whatever before. I had this struggle with the first time I had people working for me who were not working quickly enough, and the output was kind of like it wasn't really up to my bar, and like the feeling of, oh my God, the model I said, this anomaly detection model, it's not working, and I'm panicking because I have to deal with that. Ended up being the same feeling I had of like, oh my God, I have these employees and what they're building isn't what I thought they would, the level I thought it would be, and I have to talk to my stakeholders about that, and like that's all hard. That's hard for everyone. And again, getting into this mindset of like, hey, we're all trying our best. This model didn't quite work out the way I want. These employees' output maybe wasn't what I was expecting. And like, I'm just going to own it. I'm not going to let it get to me too much, and then kind of work from there.
Yeah, that's definitely great advice and good for folks to be hearing. So Bruce asked, what is the tricky, risky, creative / part of a data science project? Data cleaning, seeing if the data has any signal, picking the algorithm to use, scaling an algorithm to big data, or something else?
Literally all of those. I don't know. For me, I'm quite serious, right? It's like there's lots of possible failure points, right? There's like, oh, this data we thought would be available isn't available. There's, okay, the data is available, but it only goes back, 6 months, and so I can't really build a forecasting model. There's like, the data is available, we go through the whole project, and then it's like, oh, we ran the query, and suddenly there's like 200 more rows. Like, where did that come from? Like, what has been happening behind the scenes? That's like getting the data. You're building the model. Okay, is there any signal? Would having a better model help? How do I decide how much time to spend trying to improve this versus am I basically just trying to predict like what the next roll of the dice is going to be for a fair dice, right? Which is an impossible problem. So yeah, I would say I've heard of or encountered risks at basically every single, not hopefully on the same, not usually on the same project, but across projects. So like every single point there have been, unexpected roadblocks.
Yeah. So I'm going to handle, I think the / a lot of those slashes are actually very fundamentally different for me. So I'm going to maybe talk about 1 or 2 of them separately. So I think the risk, and this kind of goes to the last question, the risk is usually like a manager or someone comes to you and be like, hey, I want to try and use predictions about how much customers are going to spend in the future to decide how we're going to advertise to them. And because I think using that, I think if we knew how much they were going to spend in the future, it would change how we advertise to them. That is a hypothesis, right? And until you clean the data, build a model, blah, 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 do the analysis, you do not know if that hypothesis is even true or not, right? It may be there's no relationship there, or it could be a far bigger relationship than you possibly knew. And I think the risk comes in between all of that time between idea, values, future spend is going to be related to how we should advertise, to actual reality. Yes, we built a model that does that. It works. That's the risk. And the quicker you can get that down, the better. I think that the creative side, I'd say that like creative for me, like the analysis creative part is like, I really like the storytelling where like someone's coming to you of like, hey, we want to know why customers are leaving in North America. So you make this cool PowerPoint with lots of data and models built on it that like, look, we did this. And then we said, wow, if the customers are leaving because of that, does that imply blah? And like, I don't know, you can like create a narrative and a story and can really gauge people in a meeting. And I really enjoy that kind of like, I don't know, improv-ish, like theatrical, like let's get people with data to like help them make a decision that's informed. If you're building machine learning models and like putting them into production, the creative thing to me, it's almost like a puzzle. I'm like, well, how many APIs should we have? Should each one of those have its own Docker container and a module? And like, I don't know, I like all that kind of engineering connecting stuff. But those I think are fairly different jobs.
Yeah, and I think Jacqueline, you basically said that, but just to like really emphasize it, in order to, you can't necessarily eliminate risks, but you can lower the consequences of them. And so I think one way is by communicating with your stakeholders. Like if you do have an idea, like, oh, we're more uncertain versus this is going to work versus like, oh, that's data we've worked with a ton. Like, yeah, we can get you this thing. And because what you don't want is to like go in a hole for 6 months, working on this problem. The stakeholder like thinks that they're going to get the answer and you come back and you're like, yeah, nothing worked. And they're like, what? Like, I feel all these plans are like, where were you? Why? So like trying to, for you to figure out, as you said, Jacqueline, as quickly as possible, like by maybe building it like a sort of like MVP. Because I think you said in one of your talks, right? It's rare that like doing like a linear regression or something will have like no, will basically just be noise. And then if you do the deep learning model, it will be amazing, right? It's usually if your preliminary models that aren't like showing anything useful, it's unlikely it's going to turn out great. So you can, rather than spending a month tuning the models, you can maybe do that initial one and be like, oh yeah, this seems like it might not work out.
Yeah, and I think it's just a lot of building the intuition there on like at what point should you be like, this is never gonna work. And I think that's just a lot of experience.
Definitely. Those are great answers. Enjoyed listening to those. So this one's kind of slightly different. It's more, so it's any ideas on getting started with RStudio or R. I've tried courses at my work, and I have limited time and need to work at my own pace. She's a PI for a lab, or learning to build a good database. So, like, what's the best way to get started? Is what I'm reading that question out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I can start this. So I think, what I would say, there's no one like best way for everyone. So for example, some people are really good at like they're maybe they have a lot of time outside of work and they're super motivated and they're very disciplined, and so they can take like quite successfully like an online course that lasts like 16 weeks. I'm not one of those people. So I, for example, did a data science bootcamp because I knew, okay, I'm going to work better when I'm like devoting myself full time for this, a pretty structured way. And I'm in a community of other people doing exactly the same thing. And we have the teachers who can help us out when we get stuck. So that worked for me. I do think one thing that often helps is finding that community. It doesn't have to be through a paid channel. So for example, Twitter, I find is like a really nice R community. So I've seen people tweet, how do I get started in R, and get like hundreds of responses. And often people will even be willing to tailor that, like, oh, what are you looking to do with R? And they'll be like, oh, I'm like I'm an academic, I'm looking to do this. And they're like, oh, I think this book is best for you, versus for someone, working in industry, it might like in HR, there's a new book about people analytics. So you could direct them there. So I think, yeah, so that's all to say. I don't think there's like one best way, but I would say maybe like try a few things. And I think the biggest thing is try to find ways to have quick wins and to see results quickly. So often when people teach that, for example, might be data visualization. So with a ggplot package, you know, you can pretty quick, you can even use like inbuilt data sets in R and like just make a graph, and like that already can be like an aha, like, oh, that's cool. So I think that can help you stay motivated versus like, oh, I have to learn like how to do for loops and how to do this and this on like these data sets I don't care about. It's like trying to find a thing you do care about and experimenting with it.
Yeah, I would basically say the same thing. For me, I also have never successfully completed an online course. Art, data science, none of them. I can never finish, and it's actually infuriating. But what quite is motivating is like, I want the teeniest, tiniest thing I want to do. Like, I want to learn this one small thing, just as Emily's saying, and like really having something that is of practical value, not like, I'm going to take the Titanic data and make a chart. Yeah. I don't care. But really like, oh, look, I downloaded my Netflix data, my analytics, I want to make a chart out of that. Or like, you know, where you have like some personal motivation, I think that can be really helpful. And like, yeah, if you're in like Twitter and stuff, people do all sorts of crazy stuff that's really inspiring. And I think, yeah, just trying to find really small ways you can pick this stuff up piecemeal. That is how I pretty much learned everything after grad school.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's no one good way. There's a lot of good ways, basically, to sum that up. So I'm not seeing any other questions. Danny says thank you for the answer and a great talk. So I guess I can give you one opportunity or a last opportunity to like kind of wrap up whatever you want to wrap up.
Sure. So I'll just, give another quick reminder about the book. As Jacqueline said, we did the last 8 chapters, but the first 8 are all about like getting a job in data science. So if you're listening to this and you're like, that's great to learn about being a principal, but like, how the heck do I become a junior data scientist? Or I've like been applying, I've had no luck. Like, I think maybe it's my resume, or, what even maybe are the areas of data science, all of that. I just do want to say like, that is like covered in our book. Plus Jacqueline and I both have blogs. So mine is hookedondata.org. Jacqueline is jnolis.com. We've written about, I've written about like networking, giving talks. You've written about escaping the academic trap. Like if you're, someone who's getting a PhD and you want to go into industry. So we mentioned the podcast.bestbook.cool. So if you feel like, I'm not quite ready to like spend money, on this, I just want to say like, we do have a bunch of free resources that hopefully will help you. And also on Twitter, I'm at Robinson_ES. Jacqueline's at Sky Tetra, SKYETETRA. And we would tweet about like personal stuff, but we also tweet some of our stuff. Sometimes it's the intersection. Jacqueline just tweeted about her graph about how many episodes she watched of Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
I would say mine goes between data science and just shit posting. Like it's a little in between. Yeah.
Jacqueline's a great artist. Like
thank you.
Behind her is some of her artwork.
Fantastic.
Yeah, not that one. I didn't make that one. That's from a video game. I made that one. But yes. If you do have questions, you can tweet at us. We try to be pretty receptive. So
definitely remember to get their book.
Yeah, bestbook.cool. Build book 40%.
Yeah. Thank you.
Just thank you all for coming. Like it's great to, unfortunately our book came out like right when like COVID was ramping up in March, so we didn't get to do any in-person book events, but we've done a few of these virtual ones, and so that's been really fun for us. And also, like I said, I do think one advantage is being able to reach people who maybe couldn't go in person because they weren't there, or they just didn't, they couldn't, even if they were in the city, they couldn't commute there, whatever. So I, do think that one good thing COVID does make some, some of these events more accessible to people, even maybe all over the world.
Sweet. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. If you have any comments, questions, if you want to give a talk at a Seattle UseR meetup, reach out to me. I'd love to give you an opportunity to share what you've learned here or at other places and teach the rest of us about it. But thank you so much. Take care. Boom. All right, so the stream is done.